Okay, so let's talk about one of the most powerful explosions in recorded history. It happened over 100 years ago, flattened a huge forest, but the real story, it's the mystery it left behind. And that mystery is actually a warning that's, well, more important for us today than you might think. Let's dive in. First thing you need to get your head around is just the scale of this thing. We are talking about an explosion with the power of 1,000 atomic bombs. Yeah, you heard that right. It was so big that it was picked up by seismic stations all the way over in Europe. So, what does that kind of power actually do when it hits? Well, it flattened about 80 million trees. Just gone. Wiped out over 2,000 square kilometers of forest in an instant. An entire ecosystem just obliterated by this crazy bright flash and then a shockwave that followed. But here's the thing. For all of that raw, destructive power, the Tunguska event also left behind a puzzle. A really big one. A mystery that stumped scientists for decades, and, it completely changed how we think about the dangers lurking up there in the sky. Okay, so let's set the scene. We're going back in time to the wild, empty lands of Siberia. It's the morning of June 30th, 1908. And what happened that day? Well, at first, it just seemed completely impossible. The few people who were actually out there, scattered around the region, they all described this terrifying sight. A column of blue light, they said, as bright as the sun, just ripping across the sky. And then, bam, a blinding flash and a sound like a whole army firing cannons. The shockwave itself was strong enough to knock people off their feet hundreds of kilometers away. But the place was so incredibly remote, it actually took scientists almost 20 years to even get there and start figuring out what in the world had happened. So when those investigators finally made it to the site, they found pretty much what you'd expect from a huge explosion, right? This vast, flattened forest, all the trees are knocked down, pointing away from a single central point. But as they got closer and closer to that central point, the epicenter, they realized something was wrong. Something really important was missing. There was no crater. At all. Just nothing. I mean, an explosion strong enough to level an entire forest should have left a gigantic hole in the ground, right? But nope. It was just empty. It was like the explosion just happened in midair. And that was the mystery that drove everyone crazy. How do you get an explosion with the power of 1,000 atomic bombs, but with no impact? It just didn't make sense. It seemed to defy the very laws of physics. So it took a long time. Lots of debate, but eventually scientists started to zero in on the one and only explanation that fit all the weird evidence. The culprit, they realized, wasn't on the ground at all. It came from space. And the solution has a name. It's called an airburst. Basically, the idea is that a space rock, a small asteroid or maybe a piece of a comet, it never actually hit the ground. Instead, it blew up miles high in the atmosphere. Okay, so here's how that works. Imagine this thing screaming into our atmosphere at an insane speed. The pressure from the air and the friction, it just superheats the object. It gets so intense that the rock basically can't handle it anymore. It just violently disintegrates in this massive, catastrophic flash of energy. So it's the shock wave from that explosion that hits the ground, not the rock itself. And boom, that's it. That's why there was no crater. So there you have it. The science finally gave us an answer that made sense of all the facts. The Tunguska event was a cosmic airburst. Mystery solved, right? Well, yes. But solving that old puzzle immediately brought up a much more urgent and kind of unsettling question for us today. And this is why this story isn't just some dusty old history lesson. Think of it like a dress rehearsal. It's a really clear, powerful warning about a danger that we are still living with every single day. I mean, think about it. The 1908 explosion happened over one of the emptiest places on the entire planet. We got so lucky. But what happens if our luck runs out? What if the next one of these things doesn't blow up over a remote forest? Just look at the difference. Back in 1908, it was a really interesting scientific mystery, and as far as we know, nobody died. But if that exact same event happened today over, say, London or Tokyo or New York City, it wouldn't be a scientific curiosity. It would be an absolute global catastrophe. That same shockwave that flattened 80 million trees, it would just obliterate buildings, roads, everything. Millions of people could be gone, just instantly.
The potential loss of life is something that's honestly hard to even imagine.
But you know what? Even that terrifying, destructive power, that's not the most important lesson here. The most chilling part of this whole story is something else. Think about the day before. On June 29th, 1908, not a single person on Earth had any idea what was coming. There was zero warning, no sign, nothing. Just some random rock hurtling through space that happened to be on a collision course with us. It arrived completely, 100% unannounced. So in the end, that's what the Tunguska event really was, a cosmic warning shot. It proved that these things don't just happen. They can happen with absolutely no heads up. Yeah, today we have programs that scan the skies, but space is, well, it's huge. And there are countless objects that size that we still haven't found. So it leaves you with a pretty big question, right? Over 100 years later, are we truly ready for the next one?